Good morning. We are Hemshech Ayin Beis, the conclusion, reviewing its conclusion on page 1420, 1429. Yeah. 1427, I should say. 1427. And the Rebbe Rashab is explaining here the role of malachim, or specifically the malachim that are called kravayim, like the cosmic digestive system or the cosmic distribution system of the sustenance, the divine sustenance, which is a nimshal from the moshel, just like we human beings need food, and that food needs to be broken down to sustain us, to turn into blood, and the nutrients become part of feeding us and sustaining us. So too lamaila, the Aveda, like we learned yesterday, the Aveda of Yidden are called parnasasi. God calls it my sustenance. So when we do our Aveda below, it's like a form of feeding the divine. Now, of course, we're not talking here now in the necessarily atzmus per se, but it does say mefarnesin. And we'll learn later how much does it affect atzmus and how it affects and doesn't affect. But it definitely is a Muslim, like he called it lachmi, karbani lachmi, my bread, my sustenance. So that's the Aveda that we do, and that increases divine energy. So even the mere fact that we fulfill God's desire to create a dir b'tachtenim, a home, to build a migdash and turn the physical world into a home for God, that accomplishes something. That's not meaningless. It accomplishes. So he calls it a type of sustenance of drawing down an abundance, like he called teisfus eiris, additional energies that come through our avodah. So it's not just that we are revealing the divine in the world, we also draw down new levels of divine energy into existence through our avodah. So just as it is in the physical example of food and digestion, so too here the malachim play the role of distributing and regulating and allocating and supervising and overseeing that process, like he calls the process hashpah, the hashpah of this elikus in existence. And clearly it goes both ways, both the hamshachah below and also the elevation, like he said, when we daven, like he says, Matat takes our tefillas and weaves it into crowns for what he called the expression, kissin l'keinem it tfilasein shel Yisrael. Okay, and that's called kreve shem kodshe. The malachim, they bring the hashpah be'elam. Then he continued to explain how everything in existence has a source and a root above, what he calls the sar shel chachma, the minister of wisdom, minister of water, minister of fire. And the same thing with semeach. Every blade of grass has its mazel that causes it to grow. So therefore, there's a flow going from a higher level, from the source, into existence. So who regulates that flow? Again, is the malachim that do that. So all of it originates in Atzilus. From Atzilus it goes into Nevrayim. This is both Hashpah Gashmi's physical transmissions as well as spiritual ones. And he continues on with Ava V'yira, that the fact that we have love and reverence within our system, it comes from Atzilus. The 10 spheres, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, the 10 divine attributes are the source for our 10 faculties. So the root of our Ava comes from a shefa that's flowing from Chesed of Atzilus. And this is a constant flow. We have to obviously activate it and through our avodah, and that requires work. But the fact is, we are made up. We have that capacity. We have those resources. And each neshama has its particular, even though all the neshamas come from the Midos in general, from Chesed through Malchus, but the 7 branches of Menorah, each neshamas have different categories. what their primary work is. So when it comes down lamata, the neshamas have to awaken and stimulate that ava through effort, but the capacity to do ava biyacholte la'erer is because there is a midas ava. And the hashpah itself, again, flows through the malachim. They serve like you can say it like the mailman, the gatekeepers I mentioned. These are all good examples to explain their role. Like machne machal, so machal comes from chesed. All the malachim that are connected to kindness and love is through malach machal. Same thing, malach gavriel, all the malachim connected to gvura. So therefore the flow of chesed of atzilus to the neshamas lamata go through the malachim in the worlds of bria, yitzira. Doesn't go into the exact levels of the worlds, but basically in bria, yitzira, and asiya, that help that flow along, literally like the digestive system that allows the food that is being processes the food and turns it into the blood stream of the human being in order to sustain the person. And that's where we stopped, end of the paragraph on page 1427. Now, as we're going to see a little later, this is vital because this helps us understand how a neshama, when it comes below, and though it's in a state of concealment, has the power, the ability, through its avodah, with the malachim's help, to be able to access higher levels of divine energy. So in other words, if you think of it, without the malachim, it would be like eating food without digestion. So it doesn't mean you can't have any energy, but it's not really going to work. So the malachim play a critical role in helping the neshamas do what they have to achieve in this world. Now, obviously, the malachim are just messengers, and they're just instruments, and they are support system. They're not the ikar. The digestive system can do nothing without food, without the person eating food. So that's predicated that there is lachmi, there is food, and there's the person who's consuming the food. Then the digestive system helps the process along to be able to distribute it and integrate it properly within us and draw down these levels of godliness. So that's all going to be critical in understanding how the neshamas are able to draw down the yichud, the divine Hashem Echad from Shema, to the point that even the animal soul, that even the animal soul and the physical world can absorb and integrate that godliness. Exactly what a digestive system does. So you have to understand their role. Like he said at the beginning of the subject, he said, Yisrael, even though they're higher than Malachim, they're Ishenene, they're the pupil of the eye, the purpose of it all, but the Malachim play a role that the Neshamas are received from them. So think of it this way. If Neshamas are like the children of the king, and the ministers that help those children along, they educate them, they train them, they take care of them. So the main thing is, of course, the children. But you cannot deny the role that all the support that they have as they grow and mature, it comes through the malachim. And using yet another example to understand this. So now he's going to go back to the pasuk Hamu Meyai. The pasuk Ben Yakir Ephraim, and though Ephraim, so Ephraim is isn't Ephraim my precious son? And therefore, basically, the verse is saying that God says that even when Ephraim is in a difficult state, I remember him as my special child, to the point that my innards ache or are agitated for him, and rachem arachmenu, and I definitely will have compassion to him. A second, please. Excuse me. So now he's going to go back to that pasuk that began on page 1425. So, new paragraph, continue learning on page 1427. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. V'zehu al-kain homu meyai loy. And that's why my meyai is the innards, my guts are agitated or aggravated for him, for Ephraim, who's in this distressed state. Rachem arachmenu. And I will have compassion. I will definitely have compassion over him. So he's going to explain what that means in this context that we just learned about the malachim. So we learned Mei Hema Malachim, Hanikroim, Kravayim. The malachim, the Mei is referring to the stomach or digestive system or the guts. They're called the malachim, which is called the Kravayim, which is another name for Mei, basically. We call that the guts. Shal Yodam, who call Hashpaz Be'elam, Gam Hashpaz Ruchnius. Through them, as we just learned, all the hashpahs flow through them. They're essentially like the middlemen, if you wish, or the gatekeepers, or again, all those analogies we've used, that all the transmissions, including the ruchnistic transmissions, Ava and Yira, as we learned in the previous paragraph. V'zeu hamu me'ai loi, rachem arachmenu. And this is hamu me'ai loi, rachem arachmenu, that my guts are ache for him, rachem arachmenu, shal yodei, Shal Yodam Nimsha B'chinas Midas HaRachamim. So, like we said before, the Ava V'Yira and the Rachamim, essentially Chesed, Gvur, and Teferes of Atzilus. He said in the previous paragraph, Kol Hamidas, the Ava V'Yira V'Rachamim, they originated in Atzilus, and from them come the faculties that we have, Chesed, Gvur, Teferes, and Ar Nefesh. But who's the channel? Who carries it and properly allocates and properly divides it and breaks it down and distributes it? Those are the malachim. So therefore, that's the connection to Rachma Rachmenu. Because you can say, what's the connection to the Mei, to the malachim, Rachma Rachmenu? Because they're the ones that carry that compassion. Shal Yodam Nimshach B'chinas Midas HaRachamim. And now he's going to explain this in more detail. If you may recall, when we learned it the first time, it was also very short and very brief. But you're going to see here how he's going to connect it to a bigger topic here of our relationship with God. Like we said, that we serve as a sustenance. We provide sustenance, and we actually generate an additional divine energy into existence, just like Adam and Chava working in the Garden of Eden, and we plow and we cultivate the land to produce a lot more than is there in the first place. How it's connected to how the malachim help achieve that process. But to understand this, you see, he's going to go now into a whole discussion. What does it mean, Rahman Midas Lamaila? Does God indeed have such attributes? And how does that relate to us? Because like we learned about the Shemes, God is beyond all attributes. Lav inun Midas inun klal. Lav inun Midas iu klal. He's beyond any type of attributes. We learned all the way Ein Sof, that's beyond any structure. And yet God chose to manifest divine energy into the structure. And that structure in turn travels into us, like he said before, from Ein Sof into Gvul. And that's the process of the digestive system to bring it down that way, like we learned on the previous page. So he's now going to explain this system, how this works, all the way from the highest levels of Elokus, all the way down into existence. So that's what we're going to go enter now into that zone. So a lot of this is going to be connected, how our Avodah affects heaven. And of course, the role of the Malachim in this process. Okay, so he says like this, the L'cheda ain't a mover. Seemingly it's not understood. How is it possible to apply the concept of compassion above by Hashem, by God? Rachamim means when a person has compassion, it means that, let's say you see a situation that evokes mercy or compassion in your heart, that's coming from, it's a human reaction, compassion is like a human emotion that comes from the weakness of a person. Here, he doesn't mean weakness that we're weak people, but it comes from something not complete. That's why you're having compassion. So we do a pasuk that we just learned in last week's parsha Vayigash. He says that Yosef, after seeing his brothers and seeing how Yehuda was beseeching him and begging him, pleading with him for Binyamin, it says finally he could not control himself. Yosef, ki nichmaru rachmov, his compassion just simply melted him. His compassion just came pouring forth. So till that point, he had the composure and he was able to control himself and not reveal his identity to his brothers. But then nichmaru rachmov, so you see, it's a very human reaction. How could you say that by Hashem? Ki mishu abir lev v'omitz keyach, someone who's strong of heart, v'omitz keyach, and a powerful personality, a lot of inner control, a lot of strength. Lo nimtza ba'inyan rachmim. You won't find this type of compassion. Ki imitzad chlishus hanefesh shemispol mitzar chavere. It's coming from a person who's not hard like that, but it's coming from a person who's vulnerable, who's more fragile, if you wish, and mispol mitzar chavere, and is affected by the pain of his friend or his colleague. Harihu mispol barachmim. So he gets stimulated, so he gets affected, and his emotions his compassion takes hold of him. Now, of course, the immediate question is, 1 second, since when is rachmim a negative thing? Having compassion is like one of the greatest things you can have. But of course, his question here is on godliness. Since God is complete and perfect, how do you apply the concept of rachmim exactly? And you'll see as he develops where he's going with this. The truth is, you could ask it about all the attributes, but he's going here with rachem arachmenu. So what does it mean exactly? Ephraim is God's child. The Jewish people are God's children. And we say that in the time of Golus, due to their sins, they were exiled. Or let's say the Chet Egel, they built the golden calf. So they fell out of God's favor. Then it says that Moshe Rabbeinu goes on the mountain and prays for them. Or God remembers his people and then is aroused with compassion. How do you explain that exactly? If God has compassion for his children, he should have it all the time. And if he doesn't have it, what's the change here? I mean, God is God. We're not talking about a human being who, you know what, if you plead with them or they see a situation that makes them feel sad, they'll be compassionate. How do you explain that, Lamaila? That's essentially what he's trying to understand here. So you see, he's touching here upon a much bigger subject. Do we have impact on God? And does God change? We learned earlier, Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi. There's no change at all. God is Nitzchi, and there's no change. So what does it mean that there are emotions that seemingly are changing by the circumstances? I'm broadening the question because you'll soon see he's going to elaborate more, but just to really understand where he's headed with this. But he begins, the first thing, establishing this question, what is Rachmanas L'mayla exactly? But it's really the question of our interaction with God and how much impact and how much, and exactly what is happening in this whole process. So that's going to be the theme of the next few pages. It's a topic that we have talked about a number of times. How much does our avodah impact God, essentially? But that's an extended question from the original question, which is, how do you explain Rachamim above?
Can you take a question?
Not while in the middle of the topic. Let me finish the topic, and then we'll take questions. V'zeu shadasu sibus harachamim. And that's the meaning we say das, meaning a bar das, a person who doesn't have any seichel or das, I shouldn't say seichel. Someone who does not have a mature emotion, intelligence, is not going to be so compassionate. But das is sibus harachamim. The inyan hadasu ahergish shemargish azulas. Chachmim bina is more academic. Chacham is the concept of an idea. Bina is development of the idea. But das is already the category of you sense the idea, the resonating truth of the idea. Das relates to me. Hiskashrus, like he says in Tanya, that you're connecting to the idea. So it's a form of hergish, shemargish es azulas. That's why you can find an intellectual who's completely not affected or not touched and not moved by someone else's pain. But a person who has das is going to be affected. Shemargish es azulas v'ayidei zeh meseder barachmim alav. The expression, I believe, is, what's the expression? Okay, it'll come to me. So bottom line, so das, in other words, is about feeling and sensing another, and that's what evokes the compassion. If that's the meaning of compassion, that's due to your feeling and sensing another pain. So it's not shaykh l'mayla. Dani Hashem leishanisi. Here he says it explicitly. God does not change. There's no changes. Ve'ein shaykh in nispailis mazulas. And you can't apply this principle that he's affected by another. God is completely from a different category, different reality. Humans are affected by each other for the reasons that he just explained. So he actually said two things. One is misat chlishus, in the sense of being that we are more fragile and therefore we can be affected and the compassion affects us. Now he's saying from tzadas, which really means more from strength. But regardless, we're affected by it. And by Hashem, you can't apply that. Because the idea of ispilus from azulas, that someone is able to arouse your compassion, means there's a change from the moment from before when you didn't have the compassion to the point when you do have compassion. And this concept of takif and chlishus, of called composure, or strength of the strength that doesn't allow, that causes someone not to have compassion, or vichlishus, or weakness, all that doesn't apply to God. That applies to human beings. You could apply either you're very strong and not allowing yourself to be affected by the situation, or you're at that moment, because again, weakness, you have to remember, is not weakness from the human side, but from comparing it to God that is immutable and unchangeable. How do you apply this concept of rachmanis lamayla? That's the question. And like you'll see now, he's going to go say, Kamoy kain eina movin. And similarly, it's also not understand the klolos inyan hamidas lamayla. Not just rachmanis, in general emotions. How do you explain emotions when applying it to God? Kamoy shemischased b'midas achesed. Like someone that is bestowing kindness with the attribute of chesed, of kindness. Umizgaber b'midas agvura. Or he's emboldening himself, strengthening himself with the midah of gvura. Shezeh b'chinas ispilus. All of these are a form of ispilus. Ispilus means there's a shift. Ispilus means an effect on the individual who's either showing kindness or gvura or rachmanis. Shemispal is chassid imazulas. That's what makes us humans. We're not stones. We're not what's the word I want to use? We're not completely oblivious of what is going on around us. So events around us affect us. Hispilus could be the best word for hispilus, is affect. It affects us. Imazulus oilis gaber love. So it's either lechesed or gvura. And all of this does not apply to God, to the Creator. Sheyispoil mazulas, that he should be affected by another. Shezeu shinui chas v'shalom. That's a shinui. An effect by another means something that's subject to change. V'alo ani Hashem leishanisi. And isn't it a fact that ani Hashem leishanisi, immutable? There's no changes. So you see here, he's broadened the question. Started with Rachmanis, now moved to all the midas. The whole idea of being affected doesn't apply to above. So how do you explain this? And this is going to be now the next big section of how our avodah interacts with God. Now, of course, the easiest way to explain it is just to say, who says it affects God? Maybe it only affects lower levels, meaning the divine as it is in the lower levels. But obviously, it's very clear, Chassidus, that God is affected. Now, what that word affect means, obviously, we're going to need to understand clearly. But this is now the subject matter, which is broadening the whole topic of how when we bring yichud, divine unity into the world, it's not just for us, it's also achieving something on the highest levels. But we'll get to that when we get there. So it began, so he's moving away in a way, not moving away, but the Rachma Rachmenu and the Pasuk about Be'ai is now coming to understand much deeper the whole relationship between us and God. Then Malachim will come into play in how they they play their role in the process. That's the question on the table. And he's going to begin to explain it in several, well, we'll see how he explains it. So I'll stop here. This is the full question and take any questions.
So I had just kind of I understand where we're headed, obviously, because I've been through this with you one time before. And I understand he's laying the foundation for talking about whether and how we can affect God. But just drilling down on the secondary point, rachamim being some kind of chalishos, some weakness. Um, I have understood that rachamim is sourced in Tiferes, which is the shlemos between chesed and gvura. It's kav emsai. It's the middle track, and it represents a balancing stability. So I guess I still don't understand this notion of kalishus, of weakness. And also just from a practical balabatisha way, for someone to show compassion to another actually takes a lot of fortitude and character.
Okay. I thought I just explained all that. So maybe, I don't know. I thought I just explained
I heard what you said, but I mean, I don't know that it addressed my question.
I thought I asked that question, actually. I asked the question, isn't Rachamim really a noble and powerful expression of empathy and
of emotion? Yeah.
And I explained, we're talking here from a point of view of a God that is immutable and unchangeable. So how do you apply this concept? It seems to be emotions, and that's why I really wanted to wait, because I thought you'd get the picture, which is the concept of emotions is a human concept. How do you apply the whole world of emotions to God? It just doesn't apply to God. That's the main point that he wants to make here.
Right.
So it's not about the weakness of man per se. It means that we are subject to shifts and changes by our environment and by events around us. We feel people's pain and so on. Yes, that's a great, beautiful thing, but but that's the domain of creation, of creatures, not the domain of the creator. The creator is a immutable nitzchi that's not affected by things. That's the central question on the table here.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I know where we're headed here, but before
even before we're headed, I'm just laying out the question as he lays it out here. So in other words, the whole concept of compassion, or for that matter, chesed and gvura, applies to something that's been created that is affected by its environment. God is not affected by things. That's the main thing to keep in mind.
I understand. It sounds like he picked rachamim because that's the one we most understand
because that's the pasuk, racham arachmenu.
Okay.
Is that one?
Thank you. I understand what you said. Thank you for whatever. Go ahead, Rebbe Rashab.
Okay, is that one of the Lashonos of Geula, the double rachem aracham?
I don't know. My mind is right what he's saying here. Maybe not. I don't know. Okay. Any other questions? So now the Rebbe Rashab goes on to enter into idea that this question is something that troubled Jewish thinkers throughout history. So he says, "V'chachmei hamechkar." Chachmei hamechkar is an expression. Mechkar means chkira. The philosophers, the wise ones that philosophized or that probed, Chachmei hamechkar, nitchelku b'zeh. They struggled with this. They're trying to reconcile. How do you apply emotions to God? And we find in the Torah constantly, God got angry, God was happy, nachas ruach. Look at the end of Pasha Bereshis, where it says God regretted that he created existence. But then Noach brought him nachas. And throughout, nachas ruach lefana, I mean, you have expressions of so obviously Torah speaks in the language of man, so it's metaphorical. And you can't apply these ideas. It's not anthropomorphism, doesn't apply to God. It's only examples. But still, how do you explain it even as an example? What's going on exactly? So Chachmei HaMechkar And just for the record, this was discussed earlier in volume 1. Here I have marked chapter 152 in the first edition of Ayin Beis. It's page 298. He discussed it there as well. As they struggled with this question, that's why they say these mechachkei mechkar. Shelo yesh inyan amidas lamayla. They say there are no midas above. The concept of emotions is completely the domain of human beings or of creation, you can say. Not just humans, in general creation. Animals also have emotions. The Rambam, so you see, Chachmei HaMechkar includes the Rambam. He wrote a book called Meir Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. It's called Chkira, Sefer of Chkira. Other examples, by the way, of Chachmei Mechkar would be Rab Saad Yagon in Amunas V'Deis, Rabbi Yosef Albo in Ikrim, and there are many, many other Sifrei, what we call Sifrei Chkira or Chachmei Mechkar. So what is the Rambam? V'Hakuzri, from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, is another classic. The Kuzri, written like a dialogue. Tchilas Maimer Beis, in the beginning of the second Maimer in Kuzri. So what do they write? That when Hashem, Mesaken Dover means when he applies himself to the affairs of Midas Bnei Adam, of human emotions, human affairs, who inyan harachamim, b'yachsim alaber harachmim v'chanina. So in other words, the only reason we use the word rachamim is not because Hashem is capable, is in that world. It's when he's engaging with the affairs of the world, of people. So miyachsim, we apply the concept of rachamim to Hashem, and chanina. Chanina is like the same idea, chanina, which is appealing, and God's compassion. But it's not that there's an actual midah, attribute of compassion above by God. And he's going to give an example. I think this example is from the Rambam and from the Kuzri, from the Meir Nevuchim. He says like this. What is the example? What's an example for this? Kamoy hashefet, like a judge in a court of law. Shepesik shezeh chayev izakai. He paskins, he rules that this person is guilty or not guilty or innocent. The judge himself is completely removed and detached from from the din itself or the rachamim. The person who's being is receiving the verdict, or his family, or the people that are affected by it, obviously it affects their lives. But the shefet is a detached, objective arbiter. He's just a judge who looked at the whole case, listened and studied the evidence and the witnesses and so on, and came to a conclusion. So even though he's ruling on these emotions, but he himself is not affected by these emotions. So that's what they mean. When God is going to engage, Mesaken Dover literally means to fix something. But he means applying himself to Midas Bnei Adam. That's when you apply Rachamim. You could say from God came Rachamim, even though God himself is not himself affected by the Rachmanis. He ruled Rachamim. He ruled that there should be Rachmanis like a Shefet. This is how the Chachmei Mechkar, the Rebbe Rashab, explains it. So basically, based on this, the question is answered. That God doesn't have Rachmanis himself. Nothing impacts him. But because he created an existence that these emotions are important, so God rules and governs these, and therefore can govern, like Rosh Hashanah, when it says God has compassion on the people, It's not that he has compassion. He's ruling that they deserve compassion. And therefore they should be given another chance, or they should be given the blessings. But it's not that he's impacted directly himself. Now, obviously, you're going to see the Rebbe Rashab is going to negate this response, but he does bring it because he wants to show how this issue is a big question by the thinkers, the Jewish thinkers throughout the time. So that's the answer that they give. Again, I'll stop if anybody wants me to clarify that. Any questions on that? So ule divreihem, and according to them, who she'enim eschasud misrachim v'loy misgaber, that the Eibishter is not the one. He's not showing kindness. It's not kindness coming from him, or compassion, or misgaber, or strength. Rak hashem yashpia teiv. It's when Hashem is mashpia teiv, when he transmits goodness. That's called chesed, kindness. But not that he has been affected and is like an emotional state called kindness. We are human beings, and the creation, we actually experience emotions. We're basically made up of emotions. And when he does the opposite of teiv, that's called hashpah of gvura. And when below it's an expression of compassion, that's when God will be called Rachum. So these thinkers do not suggest, they're not negating the fact that we have expressions. Listen, it says in many psukim, it says, Hu Chanun, Hu Rachum, Chanun V'Rachum, that we have titles on God. They're saying that we're only using these titles to explain that the effect is chesed, so therefore God is called chesed then. The effect is rachmanus, therefore he's called Rachum. But not that he himself in any way is impacted as we are impacted by emotions. But then the Rebbe Rashab says, the ein ha'emes kain. Pretty strong words. He says that's not the truth, however. Back on chapter 152 in volume 1, he also said, I think, similar words. That's not the emes. So I'll explain the obvious questions. So why the Rambam, the Kuzri, I mean, these are great leaders, great teachers. So what, they made a mistake? So the answer is no. They're speaking on a certain level, and I'll explain that afterwards. It's like similar, if you're familiar with what he says in Tanya, chapter 2, there's the Haggah, where it says, the Rambam says, Hu Amada, Hu Yidei, Hu Yedua. And actually I should go into that a little afterwards. Let me discuss that afterwards. But we'll soon discuss, so what do they mean when they say what they're saying? Not that we have to answer for them, but you can't say that what they said is completely is insignificant. But still, the Rebbe Rashab says, Eina emes kain. It's not truth is not that way. Really, what he's saying is that what they're talking about is on a certain level, but in the big picture, that's not that way. Shari yeshna b'chinas hamidas l'maylo. So the Chachmei Mechkar, remember, are not mukabalim. Kabbalah Chassidus goes further. He says, because there are midas l'maylo. Next page, 1428. Shezeh inyan estes spheres elyenis. When we say there's 10 spheres, we're talking about actual attributes. Shazayin techtenis, the 7 lower spheres of the 10 spheres, what are they? Hem b'chinas chesed, v'gvura, v'rachamim, and the others. The actual spheres. Now, of course, you could argue, who says maybe the spheres are also just hypotheticals, only archetypes, like we're learning here. Maybe there are actually no spheres. They're just that when there's chesed below, we attribute chesed above. So the truth is there is a makubal. One of the mukabalim does explain it that way, more like the Rambam and the Meir Nevuch, the Rambam and the Kuzri. But overall, the Arizal and most of the mukabalim and Chassidus for sure go with the approach that the spheres are actual spheres. It's not just metaphorical. That we're saying that when there's compassion, then that is what we mean, that God has compassion. That he actually is the one that is kind, shows kindness, and mizgaber and gvura and power, and has compassion. Chanun v'rachum Hashem. So the Chan of Arachim Hashem is not just a metaphor like the Rambam and the Khuzri explain, but it actually means attributes, divine attributes. Zechei rachamecha v'chasadecha. Remember your kindness and your compassion. All these expressions are literal, that God actually has chesed and has gvura and has rachamim. But we still need to understand then how to explain it. According to them, at least we have an explanation, because we're not saying, we don't say God has actual emotions. There's no midas l'mayla. But now that you're saying there are midas l'mayla, how do you explain that and reconcile that with Ani Hashem le'shanisi, the question he asked earlier, that emotions seem to be a created entity, not a divine entity. So that's what he's going to explain now in the next section. How do you reconcile that? Okay, let me see here. Any questions so far before we continue?
When he says Ein ha'emes kain, and you said he means to say it's not like this on one level, but on another level it might be true. Does it say so somewhere else, or how do you know that that's what he means?
From Chassidus, because firstly, because the Rambam and the Kuzri are authorities. Secondly, because it says so in other places. And in Emes Kain means it's not true, because what they're saying would limit God, that he doesn't have these emotions. That's not correct. But the real understanding of it is that what they're speaking about is on a certain level. I'll explain. I was going to explain it anyway. The Maral Meprag has a disagreement with the Rambam. The Rambam writes that God is one, Hu Amada, Hu Yideu, Hu Yidua. He's the knower, he's the one that knows, and he's the knowledge. And he says, when God is lav, like I said before, iu midas inun lav inun midas iu klal. God is beyond any type of definitions, like we learned. The very concept of shemus, even names, are definitions. Definitions are not atzmus. So how do you apply? So how could the Rambam say Hu Amadu Yidei, that he's one with das? So there's a disagreement, seemingly. So there too, you could say the Maral is saying Eina Emes Kain. Comes the Alter Rebbe, I think in four different places in Tanya, and he reconciles the two. One of the first places is the Hagah, the gloss in chapter 2 in Tanya, right at the beginning of Tanya. He says that the Rambam says Hu Amadu Yedeya, that he's one with his das. But then he says that the actual language there, he brings from the Ramak, that is only, we're talking about as that even the. Let me look inside. I don't want to speak from heart. Let me look into Tanya. 1 second. Let me bring a Tanya here. I want to get the exact language. So he says the following words. And the Kabbalah, Rambam, they agree the Chachmei Kabbalah with him. So what's the story with the Maral, his question? Then the Alter Rebbe continues, V'gam lefi Kabbalah Sari is also correct when you talk about Eirei and Sof as it manifests in Atzilus, through many tzimtzumim. But lo l'mayla ma'atzilus. So essentially the reconciliation is like this. In Atzilus, you do say there is Midas. But higher than Atzilus, there's no Midas. So in a way, the Rambam and the Kuzri are talking about how it is Lamat, how they're talking about how it's already manifest in a certain Madrege. Actually, you know something? It actually works the exact opposite way with them, because they're saying there's no Midas Lamaila. So you know what? Strike what I just said. We're going to learn inside. That's where I'll bring the Maral. I jumped the gun a bit. We need to learn more inside before I explain what I was going to say. Bottom line, but I will say this, not to confuse anyone, that the two levels is we're going to find that there's a level where in Atzilus, God did create emotions, and he's one with those emotions. And then there are levels beyond that where there are no emotions. Like we've learned as well. Before there was Shemus, there's a level that was no Shemus altogether, no names, no descriptions. but God has the capacity to also create actual divine attributes. But how it works exactly and how you reconcile that with Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi, that we'll learn inside. So I went farther than I wanted to go in this discussion with the Maral. So we'll get back to it. Bottom line is that right now remains the question, okay, there are Midas Lamaila, unlike what the Chachmei and Mechkar say, but then how do we explain that when we know that Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi? How do you apply Midas? So that's what he's going to talk about in the next section. I'm going to stop here, and we'll continue that in the next class. So I'm on the third line on page 1428.
So this is coming up more. So this talk about what Chachmei Mechkar versus Chassidus talk, because it would be surprising if they're talking about above Atzilus, right?
Well, as I said, when we continue learning, I'll explain it.
Okay, thank you.
In a way that the whole picture comes clear. And this is a very big topic in Chassidus. He's touching upon it here, but there are many Maimorim that talk about this. As I said, one of them is back in volume 1, chapter 152. But there's it's a very big topic about the different opinions about where Midas are and so on. At the end of the day, Chassidus does reconcile them all, because everyone's speaking about different levels, and there are different levels. Okay.
Without getting ahead of ourselves, just to talk about what we've discussed in prior classes, when we were talking about the I guess in connection with Shemus, and even above Hashem Hagadol, and the concept of the concept, and the notion of even in Shuva, when you reach a high place, such a high place, even it seemed within the Creator Himself, there was a notion that everything was good, that negative decrees or negative impulses they don't have any resonance, or they don't make sense at that high level, because God is only good. But there's still the notion of God's goodness, which does seem to be a type of midah. It's chesed. It's just love. I mean, I don't remember exactly the words you used or the Rebbe did, but we talked about even above Atzilus, Lifnei Atzimtzum, the notion of pure goodness. So goodness is a midah. It's not a nullity, or it's not void of any kind of characterization or quality. And again, I'm sorry I'm not finding all the correct terminology, but we did discuss that topic.
Well, you started off saying that not to jump ahead, so let's not jump ahead.
Okay, but I thought I was
exactly
going.
What you're doing. He's going to. So look, if you remember how we learned this the first time around a few years ago, and there's of course the recordings, so it's all pretty clear there. We're learning it now again, and we're in the middle of topic. He's in the middle of a question here. He didn't answer the question.
I understand. I was trying to ask you what it meant when you said that before, in the context of what he just said now.
So we're going to learn. He's going to explain the whole topic. Everything he said before, the Rebbe Rashab himself knows what he said.
Yeah.
And now he asked this question, and now we're going to learn it all, see what it means.
Okay. All right. I figured you were going to say that, but I thought I'd ask anyways, because it's a burning question for me. But
okay,
it's good. It'll bring me back.
This is the question the Rebbe Rashab has put now. He's actually asked the question. Not our question. He asked this question.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi, and then you say there are Midas Lamaila. How do you explain that?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we'll stop here. Third line on page 1428. Yeah.